what Thomas Jefferson thought about Kings Mountain, the turn of the tide of success. Now, Kings Mountain did not happen in a vacuum. And I want to explain to you some of the events that occurred before the battle occurred. So, when Charleston fell, May the 12th, 1780, that was one of the darkest days in South Carolina history. And quickly, in succession, the entire state fell under British domination. Patriot generals, colonels, leaders surrendered to the British forces. They thought that the war was over. They literally thought that the war was over at that time. There were two areas of Patriot opposition to the British domination. One of those areas was in this area on the North and South Carolina border near the Shiraz, where Thomas Sumter had set up. Thomas Sumter was opposed to British control from the very beginning. The other spot in the southern area where there was opposition to the British domination was this location here in western North Carolina. Western North Carolina, Western Virginia were Patriot enclaves of safety. There were areas that the British did not get into. The further from the coast that the British tried to operate, the less successful they were. So I want to talk to you about a Lawrence County hero, James Williams. James Williams was the colonel of the Little River Regiment. Now, during the time of the Revolutionary War, the Lawrence District was referred to as the Little River District. And James Williams was the colonel of that district. He, at first, went to join with Thomas Sumter. Now, James Williams was a very, I don't know, he had a lot of confidence about himself. Thomas Sumter had a lot of confidence about himself. And a lot of times when you have these folks who have a lot of confidence about themselves, they don't exactly see eye to eye. So James Williams was not long to be with Thomas Sumter, and it didn't take too long that he decided he wanted to join up with this group in western North Carolina that was being led by Charles McDowell. Charles McDowell of the North Carolina militia was basically in charge of the Patriots in this area. That was the rallying point for the Patriots. Charles McDowell lived at Quaker Meadows, which is where Morganton, North Carolina is. So in addition to James Williams joining up with Charles McDowell, Elijah Clark from Georgia. Elijah Clark was the leading Patriot militiaman from the state of Georgia. And he was a real leader with them. So the British plan was to take South Carolina, and they did that. The next on the list was North Carolina. And it was pretty obvious that Cornwallis and the British wanted North Carolina. And the settlers in the Over Mountain area, this is now Tennessee, but at this time it was North Carolina, and in the area up here around Virginia, they saw the handwriting on the wall. They knew that Cornwallis wanted to subjugate them as well. So Isaac Shelby from the Watauga area, the Over Mountain men, he came to join with Charles McDowell as well. So at this time, when Elijah Clark, Isaac Shelby and James Williams had joined forces with Charles McDowell, there was a loyalist raiding party throughout the back country, particularly in the area of Union and the Fair Forest area. This raiding party was led by Patrick Moore, and his brother was a leading loyalist as well. So Patrick Moore was raiding this area, and his headquarters were at Fort Thickety, which is in Cherokee County. So this is the first instance of Isaac Shelby coming into South Carolina and opposing the British forces. Isaac Shelby at this time was with a group of 600 men. Elijah Clark was with him. James Williams hadn't joined up quite at this time. Numerous North Carolina men. So Isaac Shelby had a force of 600 men, and he confronted Patrick Moore and 93 men who were ensconced at Fort Thickety. And Fort Thickety was a fort that was built during the French and Indian War. It was pretty impregnable. It had palisades around it. It had a brush arbor entrance where you had to bend over. It was 4.5 feet tall. One man at a time could only get through and had to weave his way through. It had a body, which is the 18th century barbed wire surrounding the fort. Cleared fields of fire for 200 yards. And on the evening of July 25th, 1780, Isaac Shelby sent a message to Patrick Moore and said, you know, you need to surrender your fort. And Patrick Moore said, I will defend this fort to the last extremity. Well, the next morning, Isaac Shelby and his 600 men had the fort surrounded. And they stepped out of the woods line. And all of a sudden, there's Patrick Moore with his 93 men, and he looks, and there's 600 men opposes him. Well, he decided enough was enough, so he surrendered his fort without a shot being fired. Now, one thing that was important about that, the 93 men, they were paroled. They had to sign a piece of paper saying they would not take up arms again under penalty of death. But they also surrendered 250 Brown Bess muskets. Actually, they were Charleville muskets, loaded with buck and ball. They had a musket ball in there and 3 or 4 buckshots as well. So when that thing fired, it was the same effect of having 5 muskets firing at the same time. Fort Thickety could have been defended, but Patrick Moore, he gave it up, and he was censured for that by the British command. So about 2 weeks after that, while that happened, Patrick Ferguson was in Winnsboro with Cornwallis. Ferguson wasn't at Fort Thickety, but he did join up with the Loyalist militia to lead the Loyalist militia at this time. His position was inspector of militia, and his job was to train and command the Loyalist militia in the backcountry of South Carolina. And you have to remember, at this time, this was a true civil war. 1/3 of the backcountry were patriot fighters. The other 1/3 were Loyalist fighters. The middle 1/3 of the backcountry in South Carolina, they went with whoever they felt was going to win. They wanted to go with the winning side. So Patrick Ferguson's job was to inspire the Loyalists to come into camp, and this was part of the British plan, was to have the Loyalists fight along with the British regular forces as well. So this group from McDowell's camp was foraging for supplies, and foraging was very important during this time because these armies lived off the land. Ferguson and his group was in this area foraging for supplies as well. And these two groups collided at Wofford's Iron Works. This is in Spartanburg County on Lawson's Creek. This was not intended to be a battle. Small groups started fighting, and reinforcements started coming in. More loyalists were killed than patriots, but the loyalists kept the field. So that was a British victory. This was a victory by Patrick Ferguson and his group of loyalist militia, and this heartened the loyalists. Then Patrick Ferguson goes down, and he's hanging out at 96. And there is a group of loyalists who are now camped at Musgrove Mill. Musgrove Mill was a communications post between 96 and Camden and other points in South Carolina. The British were constantly moving their troops back and forth, moving supplies, men, ammunition, food, things of this nature. So there was a group of 200 loyalists at Musgrove Mill. Well, Isaac Shelby, Elijah Clark, and James Williams got word that those 200 were at Musgrove Mill. And they said, hey, let's get up 200 of our guys, we're going to go attack them. So that's what they did. Each one of these three colonels raised a command of about 60 men or so. And they traveled all night long down to Musgrove Mill to confront the 200 loyalists that were there. 40 miles, traveling fast through the dark. Well, when they got to Musgrove Mill the next morning, of course, everybody knows this is in Lawrence County, where Lawrence County, Union County, and Spartanburg County join on the Inner River. It's just a few miles from here. Overnight, Alexander Ennis and 300 loyalists had come to stop over at Musgrove Mill on the way to 96. So now, all of a sudden, there's 500 loyalists at Musgrove Mill being attacked by the 200 Patriot loyalists. So what do? Your horses are worn out. You know, do you turn around and retreat? They couldn't do that. So the Patriot forces set up an ambush. They drew the loyalists to attack their lines, and the loyalists just charged right into a devastating volley of fire. And that was a Patriot victory. And what's so great about the Patriot victory at Musgrove Mill, I talked about how devastating it was when Charleston fell. Well, August the 16th, after Charleston fell, there was a terrible battle for the Patriot cause at Camden. And Horatio Gates and the Continental Army was absolutely destroyed and obliterated at Camden. That was really bad. 2 days later, after that, Thomas Sumter and 300 men were attacked by Banastre Tarleton at Fishing Creek. And he lost terribly. That was Sumter's worst defeat. So within a 2 or 3 day period in the middle of August, two horrendous defeats, which really was the lowest point in South Carolina fortunes during the Revolutionary War. The same day that Sumter got whipped at Fishing Creek, Williams, Clark, and Shelby won that battle at Musgrove Mill. So this was a glimmer of hope to the Patriot causes. Musgrove Mill really got under the skin of Lord Cornwallis. He sent a force under Weems, it's spelled W-E-M-Y-S, through the Shiraz, 50 miles, burning and plundering the whole way that he went. He sent Tarleton on a plundering mission all the way through. Then he sent Patrick Ferguson, who had 2 weeks previously won at Walford's Iron Works. He sent him after McDowell. And Ferguson chased McDowell all the way up through western North Carolina. Now, one thing about sort of a pattern, if you will, as Shelby had won at Musgrove Mill, at this point he's going back to Tennessee. James Williams, he's hanging back down in South Carolina. And Charles McDowell is sort of, you know, he's lost 2/3 of his force at this time. So the Ferguson and McDowell had somewhat equal numbers as Ferguson starts chasing McDowell, because, you know, the support for McDowell was peeling off the further north they went. Well, McDowell knew that Ferguson was coming, so he set up an ambush for Ferguson right here at Cane Creek, which is 12 miles from Quaker Meadows, where he lives, and also 12 miles from Gilberttown, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Well, we'll talk about it now, as a matter of fact. September 10th, Patrick Ferguson is coming up through, chasing McDowell, and he's encamped at Gilberttown. Gilberttown, there was only one house there, but that was the town. And there's nothing there now. It's just a field, which needs to be protected. But this is the time, as Ferguson is chasing Isaac Shelby, he captures a cousin or something like that from Shelby, and he sends this cousin over the mountain to Isaac Shelby to tell him that if you don't come under British protection, I'm going to come over the mountain and I'm going to hang your leaders and I'm going to devastate your country with fire and sword. And that was probably the worst thing Ferguson could have possibly done. So 2 days after he sends that letter, he's chasing McDowell. McDowell sends sets up an ambush, but Ferguson did not go the expected route, and he flanked McDowell's men. There was a battle. There was only 1 or 2 killed on either side, but Ferguson did capture 15 of McDowell's men, and he also captured McDowell's powder supply. So that was a Patriot victory. I mean, a Loyalist victory. That was the Ferguson victory. And Charles McDowell, he skedaddled over the mountains as fast as he could for safety in eastern Tennessee. So now that's 2 battles that Shelby has won, that Ferguson has won over Isaac Shelby and the over mountain men, and he's feeling pretty good about himself. So these are 4 sets of battles that occurred before Kings Mountain ever occurred. And this is the sign to the Battle of Cane Creek, which happened between Gilberttown and Morganton, between Rutherford. Gilberttown is in Rutherfordton, North Carolina, close to it. Then that's the point where the over mountain men start banding together to challenge Patrick Ferguson. And there was 2 groups of over mountain men that came together during this time. There was a group that gathered together at Sycamore Shoals. Now, the furthest point of these over mountain men as they gathered together was Abington, Virginia. And William Campbell and 400 men came down through the mountains and joined with Isaac Shelby and several hundred men at Sycamore Shoals. At the same time, Benjamin Cleveland, Winston, and others joined from Elkin, North Carolina, and they start moving through. And the plan was that these groups were going to join together at Quaker Meadows, which is 12 miles from Cane Creek. This is where Morganton, North Carolina is. And this is the route that the Over Mountain men took over about a 10-day period. This is Gilberttown here. And they're coming on through, and they come down, and this is Cowpens. They stayed at Cowpens the night before the Battle of Kings Mountain. From Gilberttown, there were 2 deserters that left and joined with Patrick Ferguson. Told him that the Over Mountain men were coming to get him. Both sides knew what the others were doing because there was information, spies, deserters, telling both groups what was happening leading up to Kings Mountain. So this shows, I mean, there's Abington, Sycamore Shoals, here's Elkins, North Carolina, here we are at Quaker Meadows, Gilberttown, down to Cowpens, and then the night before the battle, they leave from Cowpens going to Kings Mountain. At Cowpens, there were 2,000 South Carolinians, North Carolinians, and Over Mountain men. Now, the Over Mountain men get an immense amount of credit for what happened at Kings Mountain, and they deserve every bit of accolades that they got. But we should remember the Over Mountain men were 30% of this force. The North Carolina men were 45% of this force, and the South Carolina men were 25% of this force. So we have 2,000 men here at Cowpens, and they know that Patrick Ferguson is 20 miles away on Kings Mountain. It's a hard march to get there. So what they do is they take 900 of their best fighters on their best horses, and they send them on an overnight journey to Kings Mountain. So 1,000 of these men were left behind. Now, many of them were sick. They're sick with smallpox and everything else, infirm, bad horses. So half their force was left behind at Cowpens. And that's another thing that's important because next month we're going to be talking about Cowpens. So I want you to remember that all this group knows Cowpens, were at Cowpens, and we're very familiar with the Cowpens terrain. That's a picture of Quaker Meadows, which is on the Catawba River. It's the floodplain of the Catawba River, but it's huge. It's thousands of acres. This is the view that Charles McDowell had from his house. He was one of the wealthiest men in the county. So this is the driving route of the Over Mountain Trail, and it's a little more clear than the map from the National Park Service. But this shows the route that they did, all the way through, all the way down, and now we're here at Cowpens. And they proceed towards Kings Mountain in 2 columns. You have a column on the right, a column on the left on a narrow road. And these columns are organized by the various regiments and colonels. There was, Kings Mountain was command by committee in effect. Now, when they were camped at Quaker Meadows, the colonels, the 10 colonels, gathered together in the group, and they were like, who are we going to have, who's in charge here? And Charles McDowell, at this point, was in a great bit of disfavor. Last month I talked about how he had poor camp management at Earl's Ford, and 8 of his men were killed as a result of that. Charles McDowell didn't do so good at Cane Creek, and he was regarded as slow and indecisive. So, but he was the senior But these colonels got together and they, as a group, were like, you know, we need a general to command us. And at this point, Gates was the senior officer in the Southern Command, even though he just got badly whipped at Camden. So they were like, Charles, why don't you go talk to Gates and see if you can get us a general? And Charles McDowell was like, well, okay, I'll go see if I can talk to Gates, which was the best thing for everybody because they wanted him out of there. And the command of his regiment fell to his younger brother, Joseph McDowell. And Joseph McDowell continued to lead this regiment throughout the remainder of the war. And Joseph McDowell did a fantastic job. And he was a hero at Cowpens, as so many of these same people were. So McDowell's out of the picture. We've got these 10 colonels leading their regiments. And they gave nominal control of the mission to the fellow who came the furthest and had the most men, and that was William Campbell, who came all the way from Abington. So he had nominal command all the way through. But as they marched, knowing where Ferguson was, they marched in columns like this. And when they got to Kings Mountain, and they were familiar with Kings Mountain because this was a hunting ground for so many of these people. Of every map you're going to see of Kings Mountain of how the regiments were arranged, there's going to be differences in all those regiments. This shows Hambright at the end. This was originally led by William Chronicle, but he was killed, one of the first casualties of the battle, and Hambright took over. But this is the right column: Hambright, Winston, McDowell, Sevier, Campbell. And then the left column with Cleveland, Lacey, Williams, and Shelby. So that's the marching order, if you will, and that's how they arranged themselves around the battle, except I think this one's a little bit more accurate, except that Campbell and Sevier were, these two are out of position on this map. This is a map that Will Graves produced, and it's accurate in so many ways. But this shows Chronicle leading the right column. Of course, he died early on. Then Winston from North Carolina, McDowell, Joseph McDowell from North Carolina. Sevier was here. Campbell was here on the toe. And then you've got Cleveland, who came all the way around. Cleveland was 10 minutes late into the battle because he had the furthest to go, plus he came through some real swampy area. Cleveland's position was very important because the road to Charlotte, the escape for Ferguson and his men, went this way. As soon as Cleveland came into position, the Loyalists on top of Kings Mountain were totally sealed. Lacey was Sumter's man. Hawthorne was second in command to William Hill, who was another one of Sumter's men. Hill and Lacey were Sumter's primary commanding officers, and Sumter had some great colonels, and Hill and Lacey were definitely two of them. But William Hill was wounded earlier at Hanging Rock, so he gave command to Hawthorne, and Hawthorne was pretty good in and of himself. Here's where James Williams was. James Williams from the Little River militia, the colonel, who had successfully attacked the Loyalists at Musgrove Mill, which gave such hope to the Patriot causes. Well, the governor of South Carolina at this time was in Hillsborough, North Carolina. It was a government in exile. And Governor Rutledge was so happy over Williams winning at Musgrove Mill that he promoted him to general. Even though the papers, it wasn't an official yet, but he had announced that Williams was going to be promoted to general. Well, that flew all over Thomas Sumter. He couldn't stand somebody else being general over him. And for the previous year, all of Sumter's men regarded him as general. They called him general. They promoted him general on their own, even though it wasn't official. And Sumter couldn't stand the fact that James Williams had more accolades than he did. So Thomas Sumter was not at Kings Mountain. And the reason he wasn't is because he took five of his outstanding colonels who could have been here at Kings Mountain, took them and went up to Hillsborough, North Carolina, pleading his case for him to be general over James Williams. And there was quite a bit of bitterness between Lacey's men and Williams' men right here. And here they are fighting side by side. Candler is a group of Georgians. They were about 20 or 30 Georgians. We don't know exactly how many. Elijah Clark at this time, Georgia was being devastated. Elijah Clark was leading 400 or 600 Georgia refugees over the mountains, so he missed Kings Mountain because of that reason. But these men were fighting under Williams, and most other maps don't even show Candler because he served under Williams. And Shelby was here, Campbell was here, Sevier was here, even though this map doesn't show it. So here's what the terrain was like at Kings Mountain. It was open. There were hardwoods that were dominating. This underbrush was not there, even though you can kind of see it. So from this point, this is the spot where William Chronicle breathed his last breath. And this is a picture, a painting of that moment. Now this is done by Fred Bowen, who is a really good artist. His father was a ranger at Kings Mountain. And Fred has drawn an entire series of scenes about the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I asked him how many of them I could buy. He wouldn't sell them. He wants to put them in a museum when he's finished with his project. Here you can see the gunfire from the top of the hill. This is William Chronicle. His last words were, "Face the hill." And that was it. William Chronicle was 21 years old. He was a major. He fought at Canebrake as a 17-year-old. He was a Revolutionary War hero. And when he died, Hambright took over. And Hambright was on a horse. I guess Chronicle wasn't on a horse. The colonels, the leaders, were on horses when the battle began. All the men were on foot, charging up the hill with their Kentucky rifles, picking off the loyalists who were up on top of the hill. William Hambright got shot in the leg, and he was continuing to go up the mountain riding his horse, and one of his men noticed blood coming out the top of his boot and said, get down off your horse, you need to tend to that wound. And Hambright was like, no, it will discourage the men if I do that. And he continued to ride his horse till the battle was pretty much in hand. So the Over-Mountain men, the North Carolina Patriots, the South Carolina Patriots, they start charging up the hill. Patrick Ferguson has his men with rifles, muskets rather, and as they're firing, because they're shooting downhill, they're overshooting the Patriots as they're charging up. He has them load bayonets onto their muskets. And 3 times they charge down the mountain. And as they charge down the mountain with those bayonets, the Patriots down below scatter. But the Patriots on the other side, they come up the hill while Ferguson and his men are preoccupied on the other side. Ferguson calls his men back. He charges them down on that side. They go down, and as they do that, these guys come back. And so it's a back and forth, seesaw motion until finally the writing is on the wall. Loyalists are dropping dead, one after the other. Second in command, Adam DePaster, says to Ferguson, we've got to surrender. And DePaster holds up a white flag. Well, Ferguson, he's not going to have none of that. He runs up and he chops the flag in half. So they're trying to surrender, but they're not surrendering, so you don't know who's surrendering where. Patrick Ferguson had two camp followers that were companions of his. And these were two ladies of perhaps ill repute. One of them was named Virginia Sal. The other one was named Virginia Paul, which is very convenient because Ferguson didn't have to worry about calling out the wrong name in the middle of the night. But Virginia Paul deserted early on throughout the battle. And she pointed out to the Patriots that Patrick Ferguson, who had been shot in the right elbow at Brandywine, his right arm was totally useless. And he was fighting. He learned how to write and fight with his left hand. And he had a silver whistle that he was giving commands with because that was, the way he couldn't point and stuff like that. Also, Virginia Paul told the Patriots that Patrick Ferguson was wearing a red checkered hunting shirt over his red uniform. He was the only he was the only British officer who was at Kings Mountain. The rest of the fighters at Kings Mountain were Americans. This is American versus American. A true civil war was occurring here at Kings Mountain. So when the Patriots got word that Patrick Ferguson was using his left hand with his sword and wearing a checkered hunting shirt, all of a sudden they knew who he was and where he was. And at this time, Severe's men had come to the top of the hill here. And they knew who Patrick Ferguson was. He was riding his horse about, chopping down white flags and things of that nature. And they leveled their rifles at him. And about at this point here, he was shot 7 times. And he fell off his horse, and his foot was still stuck in the stirrup. So he was dragged until he came to this point. And this is Ferguson's grave. When Ferguson was at Gilberttown, I told you about the letter he wrote to Isaac Shelby and the Overmountain men saying he's going to destroy their land with fire and sword. Well, at the same time, he also wrote a letter to the Loyalists in the area, trying to bring them into his camp. And we're all adults here, so I'm going to tell you about what Ferguson said. And he wrote to the Loyalists in the western part of North Carolina and South Carolina, saying, come into camp, show how brave you are, prevent your women from being raped. If you want to be pissed on by a set of mongrels, stay home. But if you want to do something about this mongrel horde, come into camp and join with me. So that didn't do really a whole lot to bring a bunch of loyalists into Ferguson's camp. But the Patriots heard about this as well. So when Ferguson died, right there, he was stripped clean of all his possessions, and probably every dead Patriot loyalist who was killed was probably stripped clean as well, because those clothes were valuable. Virginia Sow was killed at the same time. Patrick Ferguson was wrapped in a raw cowhide. And I thought this was the most disgusting thing you could possibly have done, but that's actually the way they did things back there, because when those fresh cowhides dry out, it's like a coffin. But he was thrown into the grave with his cowhide or his oxhide. Virginia Sow was thrown in there as well. And then the Patriots gathered around and they began to piss on his body. Like those mongrel horde, that's exactly what they did, what he asked for, and that's what he got. So when you're at King's Mountain, you see this grave and you see these rocks. And it's a Scottish tradition to place a rock on a grave when you attend to show that you've been there. And Patrick Ferguson, I mean, you know, he's got all kinds of lore, if you will. He's somewhat of a hero, especially to Scots who visit from over the water. And so this mountain of rocks has appeared there at his grave. Now, we're going to have a field trip to King's Mountain this coming Sunday. And Sunday at 2 o'clock. And I'd love for all of you to join me. The temperature is going to be wonderful. It's supposed to be 71 degrees and cloudy. So thank goodness it's not a day like today. But it's going to be a nice little tour. It's a 1.5 mile walk. It is hilly, but you will be able to walk the ground where these heroes walked, and you'll be able to see Ferguson's grave among quite a number of other things.
Will fishing be allowed?
Not, there are tons of trees. You can help yourself, Frank. It is a tradition. Well, you place them gently. You don't have to throw them. But yes, right. This is a cairn.
We're close to the over mountain men, Scotch Irish.
I tell you what, I'm going to take questions at the end, and I look forward to that. So, I told you about the animosity between Lacey's men and James Williams. At the end of the battle, James Williams was at the top of the hill, top of the mountain. And James Williams was killed at the end of the battle. He was the last Patriot casualty. And there are 4 or 5 different accounts of how he died. And I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about these accounts. One of the accounts, Ferguson actually had 1,100 men. 200 men were off foraging. And one of the stories is after the battle, towards the end of the battle, and this is why there was confusion about whether there was a surrender or not. This foraging party came up to the battle site, and a member of that foraging party was killed, James Williams. You know, another is, you know, at the end of the battle, shots being fired, Williams charges up the hill, and he gets killed that way. One story that has some popularity is the story that Edward Lacey, if not one of his men, killed James Williams in friendly fire. Now, I personally do not believe that. One reason I don't believe that is Joseph Hayes was second in command. And this is where Joseph Hayes became commander of the Little River Regiment. And Joseph Hayes was James Williams' best friend. And if Joseph Hayes had any inclination whatsoever that one of Lacey's men had killed James Williams, he would not have let that lay. There are other points as well. William Hill, who wasn't there, who was colonel with Lacey, he wrote a memoir in 1814 when he was 71 years old. And he was an enemy of James Williams. And the memoir that he wrote is just excoriating against Williams. It's just a horrible thing. And that was the only account anybody had for 150 years about Williams' role at Kings Mountain and his death. And the idea arose that Williams' men hated him. But that's not true. Will Graves, who made this map and wrote the book Backcountry Revolutionary, which is James Williams' biography, he absolutely blows Hill's assertions out of the water. And, you know, modern research has shown that, you know, so much of what Hill wrote was just nonsense. At the end of the battle, the Loyalists surrendered. Now, there were 129 Loyalists killed at this battle. And some accounts say as many as 100 of them were killed after the surrender. The Patriots continued to fire. The watchword for the Patriots as they walked or marched towards this battle, the password was Buford, as in Buford's Massacre. They had Buford's Massacre on their mind as they captured these Loyalists. And the firing continued until finally the colonels were able to get control. Now, there are many accounts, and I believe this. One of the Loyalists here was fighting under Patrick Cunningham, who was definitely here. His cousin was William Cunningham. Bloody Bill Cunningham was at Kings Mountain. Bloody Bill Cunningham was at Canes Creek. Bloody Bill Cunningham was in the middle of this group of Loyalists who was being shot after they surrendered. So a year after this battle, Bloody Bill Cunningham comes through and he captures Joseph Hayes' command at Hayes Station, 15 miles from here in Lawrence County, along with Daniel Hayes, who was here, Captain Daniel Hayes, 17-year-old captain. Joseph Hayes' son was here at Kings Mountain. And Bloody Bill Cunningham was in the midst of this slaughter, and a year later, he's chopping Joseph Hayes and Daniel Williams to pieces at Hayes Station. So that's part of the Kings Mountain story. This is the burial of James Williams. I told you he was the last casualty at Kings Mountain. He was shot in the head, and he lingered on for the next 24 hours. Now, after the battle was over, the Over Mountain men realized or had word that Cornwallis was on his way to come get him. So here they are with 700 prisoners. They just won this big battle after marching all night long. They wanted to get away. Cornwallis was only 20 miles away. So they got off that mountain as fast as they could, heading back to Virginia. The next day, as they were marching away, James Williams died. And this is another Fred Bowen painting. This is the burial of James Williams. And he was wrapped in a beef hide as well. And he was buried in this spot for 150 years until in 1910, the DAR dug up his body and moved it to Main Street in Gaffney. And so if you go through Gaffney now, there is a memorial to James Williams where he is buried. He's got 2 cannons, Civil War cannons, but that's beside the point. That's where he's buried there in Gaffney, and he is honored. Lawrence County man, but Lawrence County had 150 years to dig this guy up and put him in the square over there, but they didn't do it. Gaffney did, and Gaffney has given James Williams a proper, honorable burial. I'll tell you. Excuse me? Okay, well, actually, you can see Kings Mountain in the background. I have been to this site. It's on private property. It's near Blacksburg. There is a monument this tall that the DAR put up when the body was moved. It's in the middle of the woods. The property has just recently, in the past few months, sold hands. While I had a lead to go have a program at this site 3 months ago, all of a sudden the land sold, and I haven't reestablished contact with the new landowners. But again, that's Kings Mountain in the background. So I told you about the Patriots skedaddling. They went back the way they came with 700 prisoners. But remember, James Williams and the South Carolinians, well, Joseph Hayes at this point, the South Carolinians and the Georgians, they peel off. So now you've got the Overmountain men and the North Carolina men, and they're coming up through here. And 2 or 3 days after the battle, they find themselves at Biggerstaff's oil fields. Biggerstaff was a loyalist who was killed at Kings Mountain. And now the Patriots are encamped on his property as they're marching back with the prisoners. Now, Biggerstaff's brother was a patriot. This is brother against brother. The patriot Biggerstaff survived. The loyalist died. And while they were there, under the direction of Benjamin Cleveland, who was a North Carolina magistrate who led one of the regiments at Kings Mountain, who was the one that cut off the escape route of the Loyalists. Benjamin Cleveland was 6 feet tall. He weighed 300 pounds. His nickname was the Terror of the Tories. His favorite thing was hanging Tories, which he did with zeal back from his North Carolina county. The Loyalists, or the Patriots rather, had a kangaroo court trial. And they sentenced 34 of the Loyalist officers to death. They sentenced them to be hung. They sentenced them to be hung under the gallows oak. Now, this is not the gallows oak. The gallows oak is long gone by now, but this is typical, and this is from Biggerstaff's oil field here. They had a trial and sentenced the 34 men to hang. They hung them 3 at a time. And after they had hung 9 of the men, they apparently had enough of that at that time. And Isaac Shelby said, okay, guys, that's enough. Let's head on back. We don't know when Cornwallis is going to catch up with us anyway. So they continued on their march, leaving the 9 bodies hanging from the gallows oak. And there's the sign from the Biggerstaff hanging tree. Now, I've made allusions to the fact mentions of the fact that I'm descended from one of Francis Marion's men, Henry Durant. I'm also descended from Colonel William Ballantyne. Colonel William Ballantyne was a loyalist militiaman. And my fifth great grandfather was captured at Kings Mountain. He was at Musgrove Mill, lost that battle. He was at Cane Creek, he won that battle. He was later at 96. But Captain Ballantyne and 700 men were marched through this area. And as the march continued, the Patriots started peeling off and peeling off. And hundreds of men escaped on that march. My fifth great grandfather, Captain William Ballantyne, escaped as he was being marched further up into North Carolina. We really don't know where they were trying to take these folks. Some of them to Hillsborough, some maybe to Virginia. George Washington was highly peeved that all these prisoners escaped, and all of them escaped. The last record is 60 of them together in Salem, North Carolina, and then there's no word after that. And George Washington wanted to exchange these prisoners for the prisoners that were locked up in Charleston on those prison ships in Charleston Harbor. But Colonel Ballantyne made his way into the British lines in Camden 2 weeks later. And we know this from the pay abstracts, his pay records, that were reconstructed after the Battle of Kings Mountain. When the Patriots left Kings Mountain, Patrick Ferguson had 17 wagons, and he had the payroll records in there and everything. Those wagons were burned, and all the records were destroyed. But you know, the prisoners, every one of them returned to Loyalist lines. And that's the story of Kings Mountain. I'm more than happy to entertain questions at this time. So the question is about the advances that Ferguson made with weaponry. He had, yes, well, he improved the breech-loading rifle. But Patrick Ferguson was a marksman, and he developed a rifle, you know, up until this time, all the rifles and weaponry was muzzle loading. He developed a rifle that the trigger guard, you turn it in a complete circle, and there was a plug in the breech, and it lowered and left a void where you put your shot and powder in, then you wrapped it back around and you could fire. He could fire his rifle at the rate of 6 shots a minute, whereas most rifles, you could only shoot 1 shot a minute. A musket, you could shoot 3 shots a minute. But this was a very accurate rifle. And the British manufactured from 1 to 200 of them. Now, there was a problem with them because they were weak because of all that mechanism that was required in the breech. The wood stock was thin and it was likely to break. So that was a problem with it. Another problem with it was that it was very expensive to make. They did not have the technology. It had to be done by hand. Creating all those grooves and everything was done by hand. And the fact that it could fire 6 shots a minute, that did not sit well with the British authorities. They did not like, the brass did not like that. They thought it would be too expensive, a waste of bullets to shoot 6 in a minute. So, and when Ferguson had his elbow just, you know, ruined at Brandywine, all of a sudden there was nobody left to command the force that they had left with him, and that was the end of that.
Another problem with powder
Yes.
He's a Harry Car resident.
Yeah.
That's why your musket had an undersized ball so that it took account of the powder foul.
Right. Right.
Because in the beginning you talked about the British wanted to controlling South Carolina and then trying to get North Carolina. In that time, in that era, was it considered any colony an independent little place or
No.
was it a whole colony?
Well, the British wanted each colony independent. You know, when they passed those tax laws against Massachusetts and Boston, that only applied to Boston. Now, they would write the same types of policies to North Carolina and everywhere else. They wanted each colony to be separate. And that's one of the earliest names for the Patriots. Rebels was one, but another name was associators. And people went through the area wanting them to sign oaths of association. See, the United States was a foreign concept, being united. The British did not want us to be united. But when we started the Continental Congress, the continent,
Committees of correspondence.
true. So being unified was a new concept and idea during the Revolutionary War. Yes.
Was it true that Ferguson actually said that God couldn't take him off that mountain?
He did say that. Yes, he did. Yeah. Ferguson thought he had a perfect defensive position. You know, you couldn't attack him. Yes.
I heard, because I know some laces in the park, I always asked him to give me laces in the battle. But I heard that during this battle, the Campbell had everyone put his trig, so he got trig in a hat
Yes.
to identify
Yes.
Indian against
Right, and that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. So these folks were not in uniform. There were 110 provincial soldiers fighting with the Loyalists. They had red uniforms on. They were from New York, New Jersey, and that area. They were trained in the manner of the British regular army. They had uniforms and all that. But the rest of these men were all dressed alike. And the Patriots had a piece of white paper in their hat, and the Loyalists had a green twig in their hats. And that was the uniform. That was the way they identified each other. Well, you could say that Musgrove Mill was the turning of the war in the South. Thomas Jefferson says it was King's Mountain. Others say Cowpens. I mean, there's so many different, turning points. But Musgrove Mill now, that's right up there, top of the list, especially in South Carolina. Now, so, yes, he wanted to know, so this is a sharpshooter, Golding Tinsley. It's a little bit off topic here, but it's a nice story. At Musgrove Mill, Golding Tinsley was a marksman. And at Musgrove Mill, as the Loyalists were fleeing across the Enoree, one of the particularly obnoxious Loyalists thought that he would make a parting statement as he was on the other side of the river, so he dropped his trousers and wiggled his rear end at the Patriot forces. And Golding Tinsley took a great offense at that. He loaded up his rifle and he took aim and he fired his shot. And that was the earliest time that the Carolina moon ever sat in the state of South Carolina.
My son portrayed him 2 weeks ago at Musgrove Mill.
Oh,
Riding a horse.
yeah.
He portrayed him 2 weeks ago.
Golding Tinsley also was credited with shooting Commander John Money at Blacksburg. Well, Unless anybody has any other questions, I think we'll call it a night. And I certainly appreciate everybody's attendance and attention as well. Thank you very much.